Welcome to another episode of All About Art. If you're new here, All About Art is a podcast with the mission of demystifying the professional art sector by publishing interviews with people working in the arts as they talk about their education, career paths, and more, spotlighting the cultural sector as a really great place to work. I also produce solo episodes where I talk about different topics in the art world from the point of view of someone who works in it. Right now, full length interviews of All About Art are audio only, but depending on where you're tuning in, you can either watch the solo episodes or just listen in. Before we continue, if you tune into this episode and you enjoy it, help us out by hitting the thumbs up or rating the podcast over on the streaming site of your choice, as it helps us continue to produce the show. Today, I want to start with a simple but unsettling question. How does someone pull off an $86 million fraud in the art world, serve only 4 years in prison, and still walk out looking like a case of overstated ambition? It sounds ridiculous, but I guess we're going to try and answer that in this episode. If you've seen the BBC's The Great Art Fraud, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the story of Inigo Philbrick, the young, posh, good-looking art dealer who turned charm, confidence, and a handful of forged documents into one of the biggest scandals the art market has ever seen. What makes this case especially gripping is how it exposes the fault lines in an industry built on opacity, relationships, and reputation, rather than regulation. Not to spoil it for you, but he was charged in 2020 in New York with defrauding investors of roughly $86 million, none of which has been returned, by the way. His journey in the art world started here in London at Goldsmiths University, which happens to be my alma mater as well. And then he worked under Jay Jopling, the founder of White Cube, before launching a gallery in Mayfair and then Miami that would take him what seemed to be right to the top. But what truly fascinates me about this whole story isn't that he conned people. It's that he did so convincingly and so spectacularly that even after everything came crashing down, the BBC narrative still managed to present a sort of tame and slightly romanticized version of the story. So today's Hot Take Art Break centers on this argument. The Great Art Fraud isn't a story about crime, it's a story about performance. Inigo Philbrick sold art, yes, but more importantly, he sold a lifestyle. And the BBC's documentary, perhaps unintentionally, keeps that performance alive. Let's start with how he looked, or more so, how he presented himself, because that really matters here. Philbrick was the archetype of who we imagine when we picture a successful young art dealer. He didn't just work in the art world, he basically molded himself to fit into it perfectly. The BBC series, along with Philbrick himself, credits his early success to a sharp eye, bold opinions, and the booming art market of the early 2000s. But timing and charisma alone doesn't explain how he rose so quickly. Let's acknowledge what we colloquially refer to as pretty privilege. He looked the part, and in the art market, that's often a big help. That similarity to the industry stereotype wasn't a coincidence. In a field where value is often linked to the people you know and how you present yourself, looking like your clientele and partying with them is half of the game. He dressed like the collectors he sold to. He spoke their language and moved through their world with the ease of someone who was always meant to be there. Kenny Schachter, who is an art dealer, writer, and one of Philbrick's early drinking buddies, paints the same picture in his piece, The Art World's Mini Madoff and Me, written in 2020. He describes the late nights, the tailored suits, and the blur between friendship and business. It wasn't just networking. And honestly, this is where psychology kicks in. I mentioned pretty privilege earlier, but going into it deeper, let's talk about the halo effect. It's a term coined by American psychologist Edward Thorndike that explains how our impressions in one area can influence how we see everything else about a person, a brand, or even a country. It's a mental shortcut that can lead to unfair judgments based on our own biases, preferences, or social perceptions. If we see someone as attractive or well-dressed, We tend to assume that they are also kind, intelligent, or good in other ways, even if that's not necessarily true. When someone looks competent, we assume that they are. When someone moves confidently, we stop asking for proof. And that's exactly what happened. The first small tragedy of this story is how easily good timing and the aesthetic of legitimacy replaced the labor of earning it. If you're still confused as to how $86 million goes missing, here's the shorthand version of what he actually did. Philbrick sold fractional shares in blue chip artworks. Think Kusama, Stingel, Wool, to multiple investors, often claiming each of them owned the same piece. He inflated prices, he forged documents, and used new money to plug old holes. It was essentially a Ponzi scheme wrapped in a forged Christie's invoice. It's aptly described in the BBC docuseries as taking out a mortgage on someone else's home. Now, that's clearly criminal, but the question worth asking is, how did it go unnoticed for so long before he got caught? Many believe the art world runs on trust and reputation. High value deals are often sealed with a handshake, and to earn that kind of trust, Inigo spent millions maintaining a luxurious facade that signaled success. The halo effect helps explain why this strategy worked. Wealth and refinement implied credibility, and credibility, in turn, invited even less scrutiny. But because the market still depends on paperwork to formalize provenance and ownership, Inigo forged the documents that substantiated his claims. Invoices, letters of authenticity, even email correspondence that appeared to come from legitimate dealers and auction houses. These papers were rarely public, often inconsistent, and difficult for outsiders to verify. It sometimes took victims months of pressing for payment, or even contacting auction houses directly before discovering that the supposed documentation was fabricated. What I wish the BBC docuseries would have done is focused less on how he was anxious because he was doing illegal things and this whole glitz and glamour fall from grace, and included more on the actual reality of what led to this. They state in the series that the art world is unregulated. Well, no, he was arrested because he went against regulations that are in place. But it also sheds a massive light on the loopholes and how having little to no documentation is still standard in these deals. So, although there are regulations in the art world, I would argue that they are much less when compared to regulations in other sectors. There isn't enough transparency in these processes, and Philbrick exploited that opacity. And ironically, the very paper trail he forged became his undoing. As I kind of hinted before, let's be honest, this was never really just about art. The market that made Inigo possible is one that sells not only paintings, but a proximity to wealth and the aura of exclusivity. Quoting Pierre Bourdieu, it's a system built on symbolic capital, where belonging itself becomes a form of currency. Collecting art at that level can be about taste, but often it's about access. It's about being invited to the dinners in Basel, having your name whispered in the auction house, or having connections that give you access to insider information that benefits your business. Philbrick embodied that world. He was photographed in the right places, said the right things, and made success look effortless. One dealer interviewed in the BBC recalled that, quote, money seemed to shoot out of the ground around him. Schachter backs that image, recalling nights where Philbrick, barely in his 30s, could outdrink and outdeal veterans twice his age, casually throwing down six figures over backgammon. It sounds absurd, but it mattered. The lifestyle wasn't decoration, it was an important part of the sales pitch. That is the exact fantasy that keeps the luxury end of the art market alive. And that's where the fraud becomes more than financial. It becomes performative. It reflected something the art world doesn't always like to admit, that so much of its value is derived from staging and status display. Philbrick understood that instinctively. He knew when to be charming, when to be mysterious. He performed credibility so well that it became indistinguishable from his reputation. Now, I do want to talk about the docuseries The Great Art Fraud itself, because the documentary doesn't just recount this story, it frames it. If you watched both episodes, you'll have noticed the narrative arc follows a familiar rhythm: the gifted young outsider, the rise to dizzying heights, the inevitable fall, and the quiet mission for redemption presented at the very end. It's basically the hero's journey, except the hero defrauded his clients out of tens of millions. The primary interviews in the second episode are Inigo Philbrick, Victoria Baker Harbor, who is his partner and mother to his children, and Jeffrey Lichtman, his lawyer. The film lingers on his face as he denies accusations, holding long silences that feel like introspection or even a quiet questioning from the BBC's side, but nothing that invites firm challenge. And in that framing, the young genius gone too far becomes almost romantic. I feel that we're invited to sympathize or, in some ways, to marvel. What's missing in the BBC's version is a depth on the structural issues, the gaps in regulation, the failure of due diligence, the question of how fractional ownership remains so loosely governed, even how these laws changed after the scandal. Have they changed after the scandal? In what ways? Instead, the show gestures at these points and then veers back into his psychology and minor details. For example, there is this whole story where Inigo firmly argues when escaping Kenny Schachter at a Christie's auction, Kenny claims Inigo ran into traffic, but Inigo says that while he did run off, he didn't run into traffic. Okay, great, but hardly the revelation that we needed. I get that maybe it was to show that there are two sides to every story, but isn't that a little bit of a problem in this context? That moment kind of sums up the whole tone. Lots of style, not much scrutiny. The result feels less like a post-mortem of a market failure and a serious crime, and instead kind of feels like it's hinting at some sort of redemption arc. There's also this moment when Victoria, Inigo's partner, says something along the lines of, well, who hasn't done something illegal at some point? Well, Victoria, firstly, that shows that you come from such a place of privilege that you could do something illegal and not fear the repercussions. Secondly, sure, we have all done something like had a cigarette underage or smoked some pot, which is very different to a huge multi-million-dollar art Ponzi scheme. What's unsettling is that the documentary doesn't challenge it. That silence, the lack of pushback, is revealing. It mirrors the art world's own tolerance for charm. This fraud reveals a sort of paradox. It feels sensational because it's extreme. It was done for a long time and with such a high quantity, but the actual structure of the scheme is quite simple. And we see through the documentary how easy of a slippery slope it was. The art market still has no standardized registry of ownership. Provenance is often tracked through PDFs and private spreadsheets. Many galleries operate without compliance departments or consistent anti-money laundering checks. Although I will say on behalf of a lot of galleries, there are businesses making a real effort. We must give credit where credit is due. But the answer here isn't necessarily to bureaucratize the art world until it loses its soul. Regulation for its own sake won't fix the underlying issue, which is a crisis of trust. Collectors, dealers, and artists operate in a world where belief itself is the medium. You believe the dealer, you believe the certificate, you believe that the work is what they say it is. And belief, as we've seen, can be a very fragile currency. What this story should force us to ask is, how do we make that belief deserved rather than assumed, and reinforce that through regulations? There are glimmers of progress. The UK's anti-money laundering regulations now require dealers handling transactions over 10,000 euros to verify clients. New digital registries are trying to make provenance traceable. Some galleries are experimenting with escrow systems that protect both sides. These are small steps, but they mark a cultural shift away from the cult of the individual genius dealer and toward a shared responsibility for transparency. So, what does the great art fraud really tell us? It tells us that the art world's greatest vulnerability is also its greatest allure. Philbrick exploited that, not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was perfectly attuned to the values the market already celebrates: confidence, and exclusivity. But also worth emphasizing that if what he did was ordinary, it would not be half of the scandal it is today. It has gained this level of attention because it is exceptional in sheer volume and ability. Even for me, someone who's worked across this industry in major auction houses and galleries, it is still shocking to see how spectacularly it all played out. And the BBC, perhaps unintentionally, reflected those same values back to us. Their version of his story is sleek, cinematic, and oddly forgiving, which is precisely what makes it an uncomfortable mirror of the world it is documenting. That's it for today on All About Art. If you've watched the documentary, I'd love to know what you think. Was it a portrait of a con man or a reflection of the system that made him possible? As always, thank you so much for listening. And remember, in the art world, what you see is rarely the whole picture.